June 1, 1942 dawned with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto standing on the bridge of the massive battleship Yamato, his eyes fixed on the vast Pacific horizon as he contemplated what he believed would be Japan's most decisive naval victory of the war. The architect of Pearl Harbor had spent months meticulously planning Operation Midway, a complex offensive designed to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a trap that would crush United States naval power once and for all. Yamamoto's confidence stemmed from Japan's string of stunning victories since December 7, 1941. The Imperial Navy had swept across the Pacific like a tsunami, conquering Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with seemingly effortless precision. The Americans had been caught flat-footed at Pearl Harbor, and their Pacific fleet appeared broken beyond immediate air. Intelligence reports suggested that the United States Navy possessed only 2 operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific, while Japan could deploy 4 of the finest flat-ops in the world, supported by a massive armada of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The strategic genius behind Operation Midway lay in its deceptive simplicity. Yamamoto would simultaneously attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, drawing American attention northward, while his main force SDR, Midway Atoll, a tiny coral island sitting strategically in the central Pacific. Midway served as America's westernmost outpost, a crucial refueling station for submarine-ease and aircraft patrolling the vast ocean. More importantly, Yamamoto knew that Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, would be compelled to defend this vital base, bringing his remaining carriers within range of Japan's superior naval aviation. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, the hero of Pearl Harbor, commanded the carrier strike force aboard the flagship Akagi. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried over 250 of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, pilots who had honed their skills in the skies over China and perfected their techniques during the lightning campaigns of early 1942. These airmen represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation, men who had never known defeat and believed themselves invincible. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese plan appeared flawless on paper. The timing seemed perfect, with American forces still reeling from the Doolittle raids, psychological impact, and the ongoing disaster in the Philippines, where General Douglas MacArthur's forces continued their desperate defense of Corregidor. Intelligence suggested that the Americans remained on the defensive, lacking both the ships and the will to challenge Japan's expanding empire. Unknown to Yamamoto and his commanders, however, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been working around the clock to penetrate Japanese naval communications. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, these brilliant cryptanalysts had achieved what many considered impossible. They were reading Japanese operational orders almost as quickly as enemy commanders received them. Americans knew that Midway was the target. They understood the Japanese timetable, and most crucially, they recognized this as their opportunity to turn the tide of the Pacific War. Admiral Nimitz faced an agonizing decision. His intelligence officers were confident about Japanese intentions, but the stakes could not be higher. If the code breakers were wrong, if this was an elaborate deception, he would be sailing his remaining carriers into a trap that would hand the Pacific to Japan permanently. Yet, if they were right, this represented America's best chance to strike a crippling blow against the Imperial Navy while it was extended and vulnerable, far from its home bases and in its own superiority. June 2, 1942 brought feverish activity to Pearl Harbor as Admiral Nimitz orchestrated what would become one of the most audacious gambles in naval history. Despite having only 3 operational aircraft carriers against Japan's 4, And despite being outnumbered in virtually every category of warship, Nimitz committed his entire available fleet to the defense of Midway. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, would join the hastily repaired Yorktown, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, in a desperate attempt to ambush the approaching Japanese armada. The Yorktown's presence in the battle represented a minor miracle of American industrial determination. Severely damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, the carrier had limped into Pearl Harbor with a massive hole in her flight deck and critical systems barely functional. Navy engineers estimated that proper repairs would require months in a mainland shipyard, but Nimitz could not afford such delays. Working around the clock, repair crews accomplished what seemed impossible, patching the flight deck and restoring essential systems in just 72 hours. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, the small garrison prepared for what they knew would be a devastating assault. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, equipped with obsolescent Brewster Buffalo fighters, understood they faced overwhelming odds against Japan's superior Zero fighters. Colonel Harold Shannon's ground forces, numbering fewer than 3,000 men, reinforced their positions with whatever materials they could scrounge, knowing their airfield represented one of America's most vital strategic assets in the Pacific. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force pressed eastward through increasingly rough seas, maintaining radio silence while his pilots prepared for what they expected would be another routine victory. The Japanese had developed their tactical doctrine through years of successful operations, emphasizing concentrated carrier strikes that overwhelmed enemy defenses through sheer volume of aircraft. Their pilots had trained extensively in coordinated attacks, practicing the precise timing required to launch simultaneous strikes from multiple carriers. The Japanese plan called for a dawn attack on Midway's airfield and defensive installations, followed by a second wave to suppress any remaining resistance. Once the island's aircraft were destroyed and its guns silenced, the invasion force would land and establish a permanent base within striking distance of Hawaii. Intelligence officers assured Nagumo that American carriers were hundreds of miles away, probably near the Aleutians responding to the diversionary attack, leaving Midway defenseless against overwhelming Japanese air power. As both fleets converged on their fateful rendezvous, weather conditions in the central Pacific began to deteriorate. Heavy clouds and intermittent rain squalls would prove crucial in concealing American movements while hampering Japanese reconnaissance flights. The stage was set for a battle that would determine whether Japan's expanding empire would continue its relentless advance across the Pacific, or whether American forces could halt the seemingly unstoppable rising sun. Communication intercepts revealed that Japanese commanders remained supremely confident as they approached their target. Radio chatter suggested that many officers viewed this operation as merely another stepping stone toward a final confrontation with the American fleet near Hawaii, where Japan's superior numbers and tactical expertise would settle the Pacific War permanently. This confidence, born from months of unbroken victory, would soon prove to be their greatest weakness. The die had been cast, and both nations committed their finest ships and most experienced crews to a battle that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. As the sun set on June 2nd, Knight her side fully comprehended that they were sailing toward one of the most decisive naval engagements in human history. A battle that would demonstrate the crucial importance of intelligence, timing, and the courage of individual pilots fighting desperately for their nation's survival. June 4th, 1942 arrived with Admiral Nagumo, launching 108 aircraft from his 4 carriers at precisely 4:30 in the morning, their engines roaring across the pre-dawn darkness as they formed up for the attack on Midway. The strike force, consisting of 36 Kate torpedo bombers loaded with high-explosive bombs, 3 Ratai 6 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters for escort, represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation as they flew eastward through increasingly cloudy skies toward their unsuspecting target. At the same time, American patrol aircraft from Midway had spotted the approaching Japanese fleet, radiating urgent contact reports that electrified defenders across the tiny atoll. Catalina flying boats, earing through the morning mist on their reconnaissance missions, provided the first confirmation that Yamamoto's massive armada was bearing down on the island exactly as the codebreakers had predicted. These sightings triggered a carefully rehearsed defensive plan that would test every aspect of American preparation and resolve. The first Japanese bombs began falling on Midway at 6:20 in the morning, striking the airfield, fuel storage tanks, and defensive positions with devastating precision. Marine pilots, scrambling their obsolesce, NT Buffalo and Wildcat fighters, climbed desperately to intercept the attacking bombers, but found themselves hopelessly outclassed by the escorting Zeros. The Japanese fighter pilots, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, systematically shot down 15 of the 26 American fighters that managed to get airborne, demonstrating the vast gulf in experience and equipment between the two air forces. Despite suffering terrible losses, the Marine pilots accomplished something crucial. They disrupted the Japanese attack formation and forced the bombers to scatter their ordnance across a wider area than planned. Major Floyd Parks and Captain Marion Carl, leading the desperate defense, pressed their attacks home despite facing overwhelming odds, their sacrifice buying precious time for ground crews to prepare the island's remaining aircraft for counterattacks against the Japanese fleet. As smoke and flame engulfed portions of Midway, the island's remaining aircraft began launching retaliatory strikes against Nagumo's carriers. Army Air Force B-26 Marauder medium bombers, Navy Avianger torpedo bombers, and Marine dive bombers took off in scattered groups, their crews knowing they faced a suicide mission against the most powerful carrier force in the world. These attacks, while largely unsuccessful in terms of damage inflicted, achieved something far more important. They convinced Admiral Nagumo that Midway's defenses remained dangerous and required a second strike. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney's B-17 Flying Fortresses, attacking from high altitude, scored no hits on the maneuvering Japanese carriers, but reported their positions to Admiral Fletcher's task force, providing crucial intelligence about enemy movements. The Army pilots, trained for land-based operations, struggled with the complexities of attacking fast-moving ships at sea, but their presence over the Japanese fleet added to Nagumo's growing concerns about American air power. The most significant development occurred at 7 o'clock that morning when Lieutenant Tominaga, leading the Midway strike force, radioed back to Admiral Nagumo with a fateful message. "There is need for a second attack wave." This communication, intercepted by American listening posts, revealed that the Japanese had not achieved their objective of completely neutralizing Midway's airfield and defensive capabilities. As documented in Gordon Prange's authoritative Miracle at Midway, Nagumo now faced a critical decision that would influence the entire battle's outcome. His remaining aircraft were armed with armor-pie Rising bombs and torpedoes for potential attacks against enemy ships, but Tominaga's request suggested that another strike against land targets was necessary. The Japanese admiral ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second attack on Midway, a decision that would leave his carriers vulnerable at the most critical moment of the battle. Unknown to Nagumo, American carrier aircraft were already winging their way toward his fleet, guided by the reconnaissance reports from Midway-based patrol planes. The greatest naval battle of the Pacific War was about to enter its decisive phase, with both sides committed to attacks that would determine whether Japan's empire would continue expanding or whether American forces could achieve the impossible, victory against overwhelming odds in the Central Pacific. June 4th at 9:25 in the morning witnessed Admiral Nagumo's carriers in their most vulnerable configuration, with aircraft scattered across their flight decks being hastily rearmed while fuel lines snaked everywhere, and ordnance handlers worked frantically to prepare for the anticipated second strike against Midway. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu presented perfect targets as they steamed northward, their decks cluttered with bombs, torpedoes, and aviation gasoline that would prove devastatingly explosive when American dive bombers finally arrived overhead. The first American attacks, launched piecemeal from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, met with disaster as torpedo squadrons pressed home their attacks at wavetop level against murderous Japanese fighter cover. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Common John Waldron, epitomized the heroic futility of these early attacks as all 15 of their Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers were shot down by swarming Zero fighters, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle's climax while floating in his life raft. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise suffered equally catastrophic losses, with 10 of 14 aircraft destroyed before they could launch their weapons effectively. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, expertly coordinated by experienced fighter directors, seemed invincible as they systematically destroyed the slow, obsolescent American torpedo bombers that had been forced to attack without adequate fighter escort due to communication failures and navigation errors. Admiral Nagamo, observing the destruction of American air attacks from his flagship's bridge, began to believe that his forces had weathered the worst of enemy efforts. Japanese Zero pilots reported overwhelming victories against American torpedo squadrons, and damage control parties aboard the carriers reported only minor injuries from defensive machine gun fire. The confidence that had characterized Japanese operations throughout the Pacific War seemed justified once again as enemy attacks crumbled before superior Japanese tactics and training. However, the sacrifice of American torpedo squadrons had accomplished something crucial that would not become apparent for several more minutes. By forcing Japanese fighters down to sea level to intercept the low-flying torpedo bombers, they had cleared the high-altitude approaches for the D of bomber squadrons that were still searching for the enemy fleet through increasingly broken cloud cover. At precisely 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward to rejoin the main fleet. Following this providential sign through gaps in the cloud cover, McCluskey's squadron broke through to discover Nagumo's 4 carriers spread out below them like toys on a blue carpet, their flight decks packed with aircraft and surrounded by the deadly accessories of naval aviation warfare. The next 4 minutes would transform the entire Pacific War as American dive bombers, attacking from 14,000 feet, screamed down through scattered anti-aircraft fire toward their targets. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading his section toward the Akagi, achieved perfect placement with his Th. Außenpown bomb, striking the carrier's flight deck near the island structure and igniting the rearming aircraft below. The explosion sent a column of flame and smoke thousands of feet into the air, marking the beginning of Japan's naval catastrophe. Simultaneously, other Enterprise dive bombers concentrated their attacks on the Kaga, with Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson and his wingmen scoring multiple direct hits that transformed the massive carrier into a floating inferno. Aviation gasoline, bombs, and torpedoes stored throughout the ship created secondary explosions that gutted the carrier's interior and made firefighting efforts impossible. As documented in Walter Lord's classic, Incredible Victory, these few minutes represented one of warfare's most dramatic reversals, with Japanese supremacy in the Pacific suddenly and irrevocably shattered by the precision and courage of American naval aviators who had finally achieved the perfect combination of timing, positioning, and determination necessary to strike a decisive blow against the rising sun's most powerful naval force. June 4th at 10:26 in the morning saw the Soryu, Admiral Nagumo's third aircraft carrier, erupting in flames as dive bombers from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, achieved devastating accuracy against their target. Leslie's squadron had become separated from their fighter escort during the long flight to locate the Japanese fleet, but their navigation had proven flawless as they arrived over the enemy formation at precisely the moment when Japanese defenses were most vulnerable to high-altitude attack. The destruction aboard the 3 Japanese carriers exceeded the worst nightmares of naval warfare, with aviation fuel feeding fires that spread rapidly through compartments packed with ammunition and spare aircraft. Damage control parties, trained extensively for battle conditions, found themselves overwhelmed by the scale of destruction as multiple bomb hits created infernos that consumed everything combustible within the ship's hulls. The Akagi, flagship of the carrier striking force, became uninhabitable within minutes as fires reached her magazine spaces and threatened a catastrophic explosion. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, watched in stunned disbelief as 3/4 of his carrier force transformed into blazing wreckage in less than 10 minutes. The same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effectiveness now served as funeral pyres for hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, pilots whose skills had taken years to develop and could never be adequately replaced during the remainder of the war. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding the Hornet, received reports of the successful attacks with grim satisfaction, knowing that American forces had achieved the impossible by crippling Japan's premier carrier striking force. However, the battle remained far from over as the Hiryu, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi's flagship and the sole surviving Japanese carrier, prepared to launch immediate counterstrikes against the American fleet. Yamaguchi, considered one of Japan's most aggressive and capable naval commanders, was determined to inflict maximum damage on American carriers before his own ship succumbed to inevitable destruction. The Hiryu's first retaliatory strike, consisting of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, took off at 11 o'clock in the morning with orders to locate and destroy American carriers regardless of cost. These pilots, witnessing the destruction of their sister ships, flew with desperate determination to avenge their fallen comrades and salvage something from Japan's worst naval defeat since the opening of their country to foreign influence in the 1850s. American radar operators aboard the Yorktown detected the approaching Japanese strike at approximately noon, providing sufficient warning for the carrier to launch additional fighters and prepare her defensive systems for the incoming attack. However, the Yorktown remained handicapped by hasty repairs at Pearl Harbor, with damage control systems still not fully operational and her crew working with equipment that had been jury-rigged during the frantic preparations for battle. At 12:10 in the afternoon, Japanese dive bombers broke through the American fighter screen and scored 3 direct hits on the Yorktown's flight deck, causing severe structural damage and starting fires that threatened the carrier's aviation fuel storage. The ship's damage control parties, led by Commander Clarence Aldrich, performed magnificently under extreme conditions, containing the fires and maintaining the carrier's operational capability despite suffering significant casualties from the bombing attack. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, leading the Yorktown's fighter escort, employed innovative tactics that would later become standard doctrine for American naval aviation. His Thatch V formation allowed Wildcat fighters to compete more effectively against the superior Zero, using teamwork and coordinated maneuvers to overcome the Japanese aircraft's advantages in speed and maneuverability. This tactical innovation, developed through bitter experience during the early months of the Pacific War, demonstrated American adaptability and learning capability under combat conditions. As referenced in John Lundstrom's detailed analysis, the first team, the afternoon of June 4th, witnessed a series of hammer blows exchanged between the two fleets, with both sides demonstrating the courage and professionalism that characterized naval aviation during Hollinghoskynus, World War II. However, the mathematics of the engagement had shifted decisively in America's favor, with Japan having lost 3/4 of her carrier-striking force, while American losses, though painful, remained sustainable within the context of the larger Pacific War. June 4th at 2:45 in the Plus afternoon brought the Hiryu's second and final strike against American forces, with 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters launching from the last operational Japanese carrier in a desperate attempt to inflict crippling damage on the enemy fleet. Commander Juichi Tomonaga, despite being wounded during the morning attack on Midway, personally led this mission, knowing it represented Japan's final opportunity to achieve any meaningful success from the catastrophic battle that had already cost the Imperial Navy 3 of its finest aircraft carriers. The approaching Japanese aircraft faced a gauntlet of American fighters that had been reinforced throughout the day as undamaged carriers consolidated their defensive capabilities. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley's fighting squadron, 42 from the Yorktown, intercepted the torpedo bombers at low altitude, but the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination that reflected the samurai tradition of fighting to the death rather than accepting dishonor and defeat. 2 Japanese torpedoes struck the Yorktown on her port side at approximately 2:45, causing severe flooding and a dangerous list that forced Captain Elliot Buckmaster to order abandon ship procedure. Ease. The carrier, already damaged from the earlier dive bombing attack, appeared to be sinking as her crew launched lifeboats and prepared for rescue by accompanying destroyers. This attack represented the Japanese Navy's sole tactical success during the entire Battle of Midway, but even this achievement would prove temporary as American damage control expertise exceeded Japanese expectations. Admiral Fletcher, his flagship crippled and communications disrupted, transferred tactical command of American forces to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise. Spruance, a surface warfare specialist commanding carriers for the first time in combat, demonstrated remarkable composure under pressure as he coordinated the final attacks against the Hiryu while simultaneously directing rescue operations for Yorktown survivors and maintaining defensive formations against possible Japanese surface attacks. At 5 o'clock that evening, 24 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and 14 from the Hornet located the Hiryu, approximately 100 miles northwest of the burning hulks of her sister ships. The Japanese carrier, despite having launched all available aircraft in the afternoon strike S, remained a dangerous opponent with experienced damage control crews and deadly anti-aircraft armament that had been refined through years of combat operations across the Pacific. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, achieved devastating accuracy against the Hiryu's flight deck, with 4 direct hits transforming Japan's last operational carrier into another blazing inferno. The bombs penetrated the carrier's armored deck and exploded among aircraft being prepared for emergency launch, creating fires that spread rapidly through the ship's interior and made effective damage control impossible under combat conditions. Admiral Yamaguchi, faced with the destruction of his flagship and the complete annihilation of the carrier's striking force, chose to remain aboard the Hiryu as she burned rather than accept the disgrace of survival after such a catastrophic defeat. His decision reflected the Bushido code that governed Japanese naval officers, but it also deprived the Imperial Navy of one of its most capable commanders at a time when experienced leadership had become critically important for future operations. Captain Richard Fleming, leading a group of Marine dive bombers from Midway in a final attack against Japanese cruisers, pressed his assault despite fatal damage to his aircraft and, crashed directly into the Mikuma's after turret in an act of heroism that epitomized American determination throughout the battle. His sacrifice, along with countless others during the four-day engagement, demonstrated that American forces had found the courage and tactical expertise necessary to defeat Japan's previously invincible naval aviation. As documented in Craig Simmons' comprehensive The Battle of Midway, the late afternoon attacks on June 4th marked the effective end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific War, with 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, and the aura of invincibility that had sustained imperial expansion since 1941, all consumed in the flames that spread across the Central Pacific during this decisive engagement. June 5, 1942 dawned over a Pacific Ocean littered with the wreckage of Japanese ambitions as Admiral Yamamoto aboard his flags. Hip Yamato confronted the reality that his masterful plan had resulted in Japan's worst naval defeat in 3 centuries. The 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor with such devastating effect 6 months earlier now rested on the ocean floor, taking with them over 3,000 experienced sailors and aviators whose loss would cripple Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of World War II. The magnitude of Japan's defeat extended far beyond the immediate loss of ships and aircraft, encompassing the destruction of tactical expertise that had taken decades to develop. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan and Admiral Nagumo's chief aviation advisor, barely survived the sinking of the Akagi and would later describe Midway as the moment when Japan's inevitable defeat became mathematically certain, regardless of future battles or strategic adjustments. Admiral Spruance, now commanding the victorious American task force, faced the temptation to pursue Yamamoto's retreating fleet westward in an attempt to inflict additional damage on Japan's forces. However, his prudent decision to maintain position near Midway demonstrated the strategic wisdom that would characterize American naval operations for the remainder of the Pacific War. Rather than risking his precious carriers in a night engagement against superior Japanese surface forces, Spruance preserved his strength for future operations while ensuring that Midway remained securely in American hands. The Yorktown, abandoned the previous afternoon, stubbornly refused to sink despite suffering severe torpedo damage and extensive fires throughout her interior spaces. Commander Irving Wiltse led a skeleton crew back aboard the carrier on June 5 to assess salvage possibilities, discovering that her sturdy construction and compartmentalized design had prevented complete structural failure, despite the devastating attacks she had endured during the battle's climax. Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, located the damaged Yorktown on June 6 while she was under tow toward Pearl Harbor by the destroyer Hammond. Tanabe's successful torpedo attack sank both the carrier and her escorting destroyer, providing a final, bitter footnote to the battle but failing to diminish the strategic significance of America's overwhelming victory in the Central Pacific. The human cost of Midway reflected the savage nature of carrier warfare, with American losses totaling 307 killed and Japanese casualties exceeding 3,000 dead. However, these numbers failed to capture the battle's true significance, which lay in the irreplaceable loss of experienced pilots who had formed the backbone of Japanese naval aviation since the beginning of their expansion into China during the 1930s. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor but missed Midway due to illness, would later write that Japan's defeat represented not merely a tactical setback, but a fundamental shift in the Pacific War's momentum that could never be reversed. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviators, previously convinced of their invincibility, proved as devastating as the material losses suffered during the four-day engagement. Admiral Nimitz's calculated gamble had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections, validating the intelligence provided by Station Hypo's codebreakers and demonstrating that American forces could, achieve victory through superior intelligence, tactical flexibility, and the individual heroism of pilots willing to sacrifice everything for their country's survival. The victory at Midway provided the foundation for all subsequent American offensives across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines to the final assault on Japan itself. As referenced in Edwin Layton's intelligence memoir, And I Was There, the Battle of Midway proved that wars could be won through the systematic application of superior intelligence gathering and analyses, combined with commanders willing to act decisively on incomplete information. The collaboration between codebreakers, operational planners, and combat pilots created a synergy that Japan's military leadership never fully understood or successfully countered throughout the remaining years of the Pacific War. June 6, 1942 concluded with Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet withdrawing westward toward Japan, carrying the survivors of history's most decisive carrier battle while leaving behind burned-out hulks that had once represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power. The admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor and promised to dictate peace terms in Washington now faced the grim reality that his nation's window of opportunity for victory had closed forever in the waters surrounding a tiny coral atoll in the Central Pacific. The strategic implications of Japan's defeat at Midway reverberated throughout the Pacific theater and beyond, signaling to allies and enemies alike that American industrial capacity, combined with tactical innovation and individual courage, could overcome even the most experienced and well-equipped adversaries. President Franklin Roosevelt, receiving reports of the victory at the White House, understood immediately that the tide of World War II had turned decisively in America's favor, providing hope for ultimate victory against the Axis powers in both the Pacific and European theaters. The loss of 4 fleet carriers represented an irreplaceable blow to Japanese naval capabilities. But the destruction of experienced aircrews proved even more catastrophic for future operations. Japan's naval aviation training programs, geared toward producing small numbers of elite pilots through extremely rigorous selection processes, could not rapidly replace the veteran aviators whose skills had been honed through years of combat experience in China and the early Pacific campaigns. American forces, by contrast, emerged from Midway with enhanced confidence and tactical knowledge that would inform all subsequent operations against Japanese-held territories. The lessons learned about carrier warfare, fighter tactics, and the crucial importance of intelligence gathering became fundamental doctrine for the massive naval campaigns that would follow, from the Solomon Islands to the Marianas to the final assault on Japan itself. The Battle of Midway also validated the strategic vision of pre-war naval planners who had emphasized carrier aviation over traditional battleship supremacy, demonstrating that aircraft carriers would dominate naval warfare for the remainder of the 20th century. The engagement marked the last time that battleships played a significant role in Pacific naval operations, as both sides recognized that carrier-based aircraft had become the decisive weapon in oceanic combat. Industrial production statistics from 1942 and 1943 revealed the underlying mathematics that made Japanese defeat inevitable once American manufacturing reached full wartime capacity. While Japan struggled to replace the carriers lost at Midway, American shipyard RDS launched dozens of new fleet and escort carriers, providing the Pacific Fleet with overwhelming numerical superiority that complemented the tactical advantages gained through combat experience and technological innovation. The personal stories of individual participants reflected the broader transformation of American military capabilities during the crucial middle period of World War II. Lieutenant Dick Best, whose precise dive bombing had crippled the Akagi, returned to the United States suffering from tuberculosis contracted during the battle but lived to see his country achieve total victory over the empire that had once seemed invincible. Captain Joseph Rochefort and his station hypocodebreakers, whose intelligence breakthrough had made the American victory possible, received minimal recognition during the war but were later acknowledged as having contributed as much to Allied victory as any combat unit in the Pacific theater. Their work demonstrated that modern warfare required not only courage and tactical skill, but also the systematic application of intelligence analysis and cryptographic expertise. As documented in Ronald Spector's authoritative Eagle Against the Sun, the Battle of Midway represented the moment when American forces seized the Tianjin initiative in the Pacific War and never again relinquished their strategic advantage over Japanese forces. The victory provided the foundation for the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific to the shores of Japan itself, vindicating the sacrifice of those who died in the waters around a tiny atoll that most Americans had never heard of before. June 4, 1942, but which became forever synonymous with one of their nation's greatest naval victories.